From the intersection of 218 and 80, with rivers like our own that seek for seas they never find. I'm Aaron McNally, and this is Curiosity Now.
Let me ask you a question, Bob. Your dad was, what rank did he achieve in the military?
He retired as a colonel.
Now, how would you describe your dad's politics?
He called himself middle of the road. I always thought he would be more accurately described as conservative. By today's standards, it's like, what's the point? I mean, the center of gravity is shifted. So certainly on, social issues, cultural issues, he'd be extremely conservative by today's standards. But that is true of a lot of people his age. I mean, he was born in 1919. So,
how old was he when he died?
He was 68.
Okay.
You
said something about center of gravity. What did you mean by that?
Well, I mean, the political center of gravity has changed. I mean, for example, nobody was even talking about gay marriage. Like when I was a kid and even in high school, there were almost no gay people out of the closet in where I lived, at least. Certainly nobody was talking about gay marriage. So on those kinds of issues, if you had asked, are you in favor of gay marriage?
Social issues have come more to the forefront in the past.
Well, they've just moved to the left. I mean, this is one thing that, is a big source of political contention now. Even though I think gay rights per se are, fairly widely accepted across the spectrum, not universally. And then some new issues that have arisen are even more controversial on the right.
Sure.
And so,
you said one time to Mickey, you said something about, hey, you can read this as a culture war issue, but, another way of reading it is that people who have been suppressed historically are finally achieving the ability to express themselves in public discourse. And that's not a necessarily bad thing. It's complicating with respect to politics when politics is so, there are so many competing forces, right? The monetization of fossil fuel, the threat of nuclear, yada yada. You know what I'm saying? Like, so culture war issues are very, very important, but they also complicate how we're dealing with serious threats.
Yeah, they do. I mean, I don't know in what context I talked about kind of more people being able to express their opinion, but look, just the degree of contention, which I think is exacerbated by social media. Social media has a lot of benefits, but I think we haven't kind of figured out how to fully harness its potential and kind of minimize the downside. And
put a pin in that, would you? Because I'd like to come back to that later.
Well, just, on Twitter, one of the best ways to pick up followers rapidly is point to kind of the worst thing that anybody is saying on the other side of the political spectrum. So if you're, Democrat, find a Republican saying something crazy. If you're Republican, find a Democrat saying something crazy. And then trumpet that as if it's typical of the group, of the other tribe. That's the way that's a surefire way to get a lot of followers on Twitter. And so the more and more, the most tribalistic people are the most powerful people on Twitter. And, not that all of the people with a lot of followers are like that, but, a whole lot are. And so, of course, social media came into being in a context that was already somewhat polarized politically in America. This has been happening for several decades.
At least since the 70s or late 60s or early 60s, actually, with because Kennedy v. Nixon, right?
Yeah, well, in a sense, politics has always been contentious, but certainly in the 60s, it was
not just contentious. No, not just contentious. Kennedy did the whole thing where this is a guy who represents the idea of evolution, like this is a new way of doing politics. This is like something like that. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, he cast himself as, being, part of a new generation taking power. Um, uh, but I think, in the 60s, you still had a certain amount of, you had, for example, you had a lot more bipartisan. Congress was just manifestly less polarized. You had more people reaching across the aisle, voting with people in other parties. That has declined over the long run. The rhetoric
In a
has
quick
gotten
read,
nastier.
would
The
you say
rhetoric has
that's
gotten nastier.
is that a technological issue, or is that
Oh,
how
I
do
think
you,
that I think the causes are
because you're an evolutionary
complex.
guy. I love talking to you because you're so interested in the evolution of the species.
Well, yeah, I mean the dynamics of, the psychology of tribalism, some people call it, is a product of it, and that's the main connection I see to evolution.
You don't think
And
it's just a technological fluke?
well, I think technology sometimes complicates things, exacerbates things. But for example, the end of the first Cold War, I think, kind of reduced the amount of natural cohesion in America.
Okay,
There had been this
that's delicious.
perception of a common enemy,
I want to hear this. Yeah, perception to common enemy. Go ahead.
and then the Cold War ended, so we didn't have that to unify us. I mean, that hadn't been always completely cohesive. I mean, the Vietnam War became controversial, and so that was a very divisive period, and I remember that. But then
How,
the
can
'80s
I ask?
were more placid.
Can I put up just okay, let's get back to the 80s. But how old were you when we went to Vietnam?
Well, you know, when in the early '60s, I was like 5, 6 years old. That's when it started happening. It didn't really hit my radar screen until I was probably 10, which was
So,
1967.
so you had no risk of being drafted.
No, I didn't. My brother did, but by that time they had gone to a lottery system and he got a high number, and so he didn't get drafted.
Okay, I have two uncles who fought in Vietnam.
How do they feel about it?
Good question. I've never been able to ask him
Huh.
a legitimate question to have a reasonable conversation.
So, but
My dad one time told me that his brother Charlie gave him an account of firing guns into the dark in the
in
middle of the
Vietnam,
night. Yeah.
yeah, that was a very contentious time in America. I mean, that was the last time that things were, I would say, at all comparable in terms of intense international conflict in America to where they are now, and that was very different. It was very, it was a little more generational. It was a little more young versus old, not entirely by any means. And uh, it was, but it got wild, and we got over it, so that can happen. Bombs were going off, and the weathermen were there, and but students were killed by National Guardsmen at Kent State University.
Right, yeah.
So it's
My humanities teacher, when I was an undergrad at university, my humanities teacher made a brilliant move. He said, "Okay, I'm going to send you out. I want you to do some homework this weekend. I want you to call up one of your parents or your grandparents." And I went over to my granddad's house, and he said, "I want you to ask them if they remember the Kent State occurrence."
Mhm.
And yeah, that was a fucking good assignment. I learned a lot from that.
Yeah, that's the what is it? I guess the Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young song "Four Dead in Ohio." It's about Kent State. So
I finally found a great song Bob loves. You're always shitting on Dylan, but that's great. Yeah, you love Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young. That song's great. Yeah.
I'm not a huge fan, but that's a
No,
good song.
no, you're
Anyway,
not. You're not a fan
anyway,
at all. Actually, yeah.
what you mean Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young, or
No, you're not a fan of Dylan
I'm
at
not a
all.
big Dylan
You
fan.
think he's an idiot savant, I believe you once called him. This is a distraction. I don't mean to digress.
Yeah, I don't have much more to say about Vietnam. It was a very different time.
Well, your dad was so the vibe I get from you is that you believe that you're always talking about like kind of international diplomacy, law, stuff, UN sanction, no, not sanctions, but UN distinctions about what is right and wrong with respect to warfare, and
What is
you had
what is legal and illegal?
yeah, legal and illegal. Yeah, like you'd like to have delineations about what we ought to be able to accept and discard. And I'm just really curious about it because I think a lot of that must stem from your respect for your father. I would think.
Well, he didn't talk about international law a lot. No. On the other hand, he was a very law-abiding person. And the other thing, I think he was very good at looking at things from other people's points of view, and that's not unrelated to international law because the people. I mean, if you're gonna respect international law, you have to be able to look at your own country's behavior from the eyes of other people and realize that, when we invaded Iraq, that looks to them kind of like Russia invading Ukraine, and there's a reason for that. Uh, Both are transborder aggression that is not warranted under international law and is not sanctioned by the United Nations. I think.
And do you think that if your father was alive today, he would feel the same way?
It's hard to say how he would feel about specific things. I mean, I know I don't have that many data points. I know that, my father fought in World War II. He was at Normandy in the Battle of the Bulge and everything. And I know he thought,
Wait. Your
yeah,
father was at Normandy?
yeah, I mean, he was like he landed, he didn't land on D-Day because he was in the artillery. So on D-Day, he was floating around in a boat, which he said was actually about as terrifying as anything because bombs were dropping. The Germans were bombing them, and like he saw at one point, he saw a boat exactly like his, a couple hundred yards away take a direct hit, and he said it's just the most helpless feeling in the world. You have no control of your fate. You can't. You're just sitting there watching bombs fall. But anyway, but he said, I know he said he didn't think they should have started out by dropping an atomic bomb on a Japanese city. He said they thought they should have just dropped one like offshore as a demonstration of the capability they had.
Right.
And certainly a lot of people who fought in World War II were totally fine with them dropping bombs on Japanese cities. So I guess in that sense, he was less hawkish than some. Eventually he came to view the Vietnam War as a mistake. He didn't when he was in the thick of things. I mean, he was in the Army, and not many people on the military base did view it as a mistake. They're in the Army. It was interesting because we were in San Francisco, so there was the Presidio of San Francisco used to be a military base, and I lived on it when I was 12, 13 years old, and it was it was a wild time. I mean, I remember once driving on to base through just tens of thousands of protesters along Lombard Street, and of course they were protesting kind of against us. I mean, we were the bad guys, we were the Army, and so it's a very it was a very wild time, but it's almost every military officer would have supported the Vietnam War at that time in 1968-69. A few years later, my father came to see Vietnam as a mistake, though. So I don't know what he'd think about things, but I do think he was just good at viewing things from other people's point of view. I think my mother was too. And because my father had, he'd had a very hard childhood. His father was a sharecropper in West Texas. Both his parents died when he was young. By the time he was 13 or 14, they were both dead. Several of his siblings had died. I mean, this is a Great Depression. And so
He told me you saw the house. It was a hovel.
Well, he took me to the place he thought it had been. There was nothing standing. It had never been a house. It was a dugout where he grew up. It was like his father would dig a couple of feet into the ground and then put wood along as a wall. Would then build a wall around it, and that was that. But I think because he was then thrown into an environment kind of so different from that when he joined the Army, I think that makes better And before that, I mean, he went and worked on the rail. Dropped out of high school, worked in the railroad, went and worked on the Civilian Conservation Corps, with the Army, and so on. I think when you're kind of pulled out of your element at a fairly young age, you are forced to get better at looking at things from other points of view, because you're having experiences you never had. You got to figure these cultures out, and
And you were very fortunate because you had a community college professor say, "Hey, you could go to Princeton or something," and you said, "Oh,
it wasn't a community
maybe I
college. I
could."
mean, I went to high school in Texas. My freshman year, I went to TCU, and it was actually a high school English teacher who, when she found out I was going to TCU, kind of said, "You sure you should name a little higher?" You know, she actually put the name Princeton in my head, I think. So I transferred to Princeton. And although TCU, I would note, is now ranked number 7 in the country.
That's a dope
Collegiate
ass ranking.
football,
Yeah, sure. But
more than Princeton can say. But
what changed for you when you went to New Jersey and attended that college?
well, that was very alien culture. I mean, uh, I'd never been in the Northeast at all. We had lived in Virginia, a couple of different, but I'd never been in that part of the country. I'd certainly never been in that cultural milieu where you had a lot of people who'd been to prep school, and so it was kind of alien. But I do think I had an advantage in having moved around all my life, because I'd encountered new cultures before. Because sometimes I would go to school on an army base, sometimes I go to school in the city. So like going to school at a public school in San Francisco in the late 60s, like an urban school, first 6th grade at an elementary school, and then junior high, that was a real shift from anything I had ever witnessed, especially at that time in American cultural history. But so
Did
I
that
think
prompt you? So, do you think that prompted your eventual cosmopolitanism?
That's an interesting question. That's an interesting word to apply to my family. Because on the one hand, I mean, my relatives are really from like what you would culturally call red state America. Now, in those days, Texas still voted Democratic usually, but that's part of what I was referring to when I said there was still bipartisan voting. You had conservatives and Democratic Party. Um, Cosmopolitan is certainly not a word you would have naturally applied to my family. I mean, I didn't if you think of that as kind of, culturally sophisticated and so on, I mean, my parents, they watched the Lawrence Welk show. I don't know if you know what that is, but
Yeah, I
it's
love
not,
Lone Dog.
yeah,
Actually,
it's
I
not,
actually love that show.
it's very middle American. I mean, I never heard classical music as a kid, never heard opera, never, went to highbrow movies or anything. So they weren't cosmopolitan in some senses of the word, but because they had, been around a little, they had lived in Europe after the war, and they had lived in different parts of the country.
When you say Europe, what countries in specific?
Well, they after the war, my dad stayed in Germany and my mother joined him, and my oldest sister was born there. So they lived in occupied Germany. Before I came along, my older 3 siblings lived in Panama. Uh, my dad spent a year in Korea, but we stayed stateside during that.
Bob,
So
What's your birth year?
1957.
7. Okay. Yeah, same as my dad. Okay, go ahead.
So, they got around. I mean, you compared them to uh, my extended family in West Texas, and they might have seemed more cosmopolitan, but they weren't. They weren't what you would. It's like they were not culturally sophisticated. You would say, and but smart. My parents were smart. They weren't. You wouldn't say they were intellectual. I mean, I didn't hear any. We didn't discuss the mind body problem at the dinner table, but they both, I think they were both sharp.
They had ideas about what a soul meant in the
Well,
context
they were
of
conventionally religious. They didn't have to ponder that much. I mean,
what
they were Southern Baptists.
what Southern Baptist. Okay,
Yeah.
that's where you got saved when you were 13 or something like that.
Oh, younger than that. I think I was probably just 9 or so. And it was a service my parents weren't at. It was a revival service. And at the end of at the end of any Southern Baptist service, they would have an altar call, an invitation to come. People who had not yet surrendered their lives to Christ were invited to do that. And they certainly do that during a so-called revival, where they bring in a guest minister whose like mission is to get as many people up to the altar as possible. And I kind of spontaneously went. I mean, my parents weren't with me, and I went up to the church, and then later I was baptized as a result of that. A couple of weeks later, by the regular pastor, and this is in El Paso, Texas, and I later heard that my parents were worried that I wasn't old enough to make that kind of decision,
Yeah,
which
you
I
said
thought was
that. Yeah.
interesting because they were very religious. They would, in principle, be very happy to hear that their child had done this, but they didn't think it was something you should do lightly.
Right.
And, part of the whole kind of idea of Baptists is that baptism it's a decision you make. You're not baptized as an infant the way you are in Catholicism.
Right.
So yeah, that was church was a big part of my life growing up.
Did that? I don't know how to phrase this, but I'm going to try to throw out some ideas. You made a brilliant distinction between the decision to baptize oneself in juxtaposition against a Catholic, baptism at infancy. How do you think about the idea of the soul?
Well, I don't know. I think about the soul. I think a lot about the existence of consciousness. I mean, I guess if it turned out that conscious experience somehow persists after the end of your physical life, then I would say there is a soul. But I don't have any data on that.
What do
We
you
don't have
feel
much
about it?
reliable
What do you feel
testimony on
about it?
that question.
What do you feel about it?
I mean, I consider consciousness itself a kind of miracle. We can't figure out why it exists or what it is.
You talk about that a lot. You talk about looking at your dog's eyes, and yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting how the apprehension of subjective experience transforms your relationship to another being. I mean, if I just intuitively think that my dogs have subjective experience, and if I didn't think that, I think I would treat them very differently. So anyway, as for a soul, I mean, consciousness is an amazing thing, and subject, by which I just mean subjective experience, not self-consciousness necessarily, although human beings are also aware of themselves. But I just mean the fact that it's like something to be alive, as Thomas Nagel roughly put it. It's what gives life meaning. I mean, if we didn't have subjective experience, if we couldn't feel pleasure, pain, apprehend beauty subjectively, and so on, I mean, what would the point be? We'd be robots. So it's interesting to me that this thing that imbues life with meaning is something we completely do not understand. And I mean, I try to be intellectually humble and not profess more confidence than I think I have. But anybody who thinks they understand consciousness, like it's explained, we know why it's here, we know what it is. I'm sorry, they're just confused.
They're minimizing something.
They either don't understand the mind-body problem to begin with, or they're making an error somewhere else. I'm sorry. It's just,
I suppose the one exception would be Dan Dennett.
He, unlike the rest of us, sees to the heart of the problem and realizes that it's been explained. Yeah, no, I think his actual kind of intuition is that consciousness doesn't exist. That's what his mentor, his mentor was Gilbert Ryle, who
Tell
came
me
up
about that, Gilbert Ryle.
He I'm trying to think, what was his book, The Concept of Mind? Anyway, he came up with the phrase "ghost in the machine."
Yeah.
And I think his belief was that consciousness did not exist. And I've always accused Dan of believing that, but he denies it. But still,
no, he doesn't. Yeah.
But it seems to me that what he says about it adds up to believing it doesn't exist. But anyway, there's a long conversation between me and him on YouTube. If people,
I've seen it.
on Google
it. I've watched it more than once, actually.
Yeah, it was a long time ago.
Why do you feel compelled to put so much work into conversing with people with whom you disagree? Do you think that you are able to draw out new ideas, or do you think is it just a thing you do because you like to argue, or what's the motivation?
I probably don't do enough of it. I mean, it's natural
Why do you
to
say
see.
probably don't do enough of it? Why do you say that?
Well, I would say, on my podcast, the conversations I've had about Ukraine, I would say 1 in 5 of those has been with somebody I pretty strongly disagreed with, and maybe it should be more like 1 in 3 or 2. But but over the years, yeah, I've covered the spectrum, I think, and I actually I almost always wind up enjoying it. I mean, sometimes I don't look forward to it because you think of your kind of ideological adversaries as people you don't want to talk to, but I find that the conversation has a civilizing influence, and you usually wind up liking them.
How do you link that to cognitive empathy, which is the thing you value so much?
Yeah, well, so cognitive empathy, meaning just, perspective taking, not necessarily like identifying with their feelings or anything, which is emotional empathy, but, understanding what's going on in people's heads I'm a big evangelizer about that. And because I think if we all got better at it, the world would be a way better place, fewer wars, and so on. Um, and
That's a bold claim, Bob. That's a very bold claim.
Well, it's actually conventional wisdom. I mean, if you ask historians what started World War One, a lot of them will describe a dynamic where each side, when they saw a military buildup on the other side, took it to be offensive intent and decided they needed therefore more defense. So they built up their arms, and the other side took that as offensive, even though it was meant largely defensively. So I would say that was a case, and this happens repeatedly in the history of international affairs.
I saw a quiz floating over Twitter about what caused World War II, and a lot of people selected the bombing of Pearl Harbor as the start. That's not the
Well,
start at all.
not the
Yeah,
start. No, I mean, I would say there, one place cognitive empathy could have come in handy is maybe at the end of World War One. If more people had said, well, if we inflict these horrendous reparations on Germany, what is the likely effect on national psychology? Now, you couldn't have predicted with any confidence, that a Hitler would arise, but you could see that, if you condemn a people to impoverishment, it will probably lead to a certain amount of embitterment, and it is that kind of environment that I think makes it easier for a Hitler to arise. Now they had actually undergone a certain amount of economic recovery and then been pushed back down into the kind of economic doldrums by the depression. So it wasn't the case that the economic hard times inflicted by the post World War One, the terms of the post World War One settlement, uh, you know, persisted unrelievedly. But during that first phase of kind of impoverishment, Hitler started getting a little traction, and the movement he tapped into started getting traction. And so that's a case where you might have asked, well, is it really wise? Is it really in our interest to create, enduring embitterment toward us? That can play out a lot of ways. And I would say that was not the only factor in Hitler's rise, but something you might think about. I say the same thing about Russia after the Cold War. This is a country adjusting to the status of being a declining superpower. Suddenly, they're no longer a co-equal of the U.S., which they kind of thought they were during the Cold War. And then in the 90s, they underwent horrible economic times. Not that we intentionally inflicted them, but they did. And I think if you had taken all that into account, you might not have done a lot of things we did, including the expansion of NATO, but by no means only that. That's my view, at least, that cognitive empathy could, just perspective taking, just being aware of what's going on in the heads of other people to the extent that you can, and we never know for sure, but to the extent that you can come up with some rough idea of what it's like to be them, try to make use of that with everybody, allies, adversaries, frenemies, everybody. And I think that the failure to do that has gotten us into trouble repeatedly.
As a fellow writer, I hear the whole essence of writing a document.
Yeah. By the way, your volume just dropped pretty considerably. About 30
Sorry
seconds.
to hear that. Can you hear it?
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. No. I want hold up for a second because I want to ask. So, like, I know you're a very savvy person and you don't have any delusions about solving international problems overnight or anything like that. But you have been working as a writer for a few decades. And I mean, you started off right out of the gate. You started off writing a book about scientists at the edge of technological advance with three scientists and their gods. And after that, you went on to do really remarkable things, Bob. You did the evolution of God. You did non-zero. You know, um, something about the way you perceive the capability of human consciousness convinces you, I suspect, that there's the capability of our species to reach toward a potential resolution or at the very least minimization of horror.
Of what? Of
Horror.
horror. So that we have the potential to make things better and avoid catastrophe, and you mean?
Not just that we have the potential, but I suspect that you think that we are innately working toward that sort of resolution.
Oh, I wouldn't say I consider it assured at all. I mean, I think
It's not assured, no.
not that easy to be optimistic right now.
What okay, perfect. Okay. What would you say different when if you were publishing The Evolution of God tomorrow, or if you were publishing Non-Zero tomorrow, what would you say differently when you're doing press
Yeah,
conferences?
there are things that would be different, but I think the main message wouldn't be different. I mean, if you read Non-Zero, it says, there are we are undergoing turbulence as we were even then, and there you can look at the world in a way that makes it seem very chaotic, but you can also look at it as the world moving toward kind of a new level of equilibrium.
Okay,
Uh,
this is how I wanted to start this conversation. I'm gonna pause you. So I don't know if you know this guy. You might know him actually, because you're into evolution, right? This guy Richard Dawkins. You know that guy?
yeah, yeah,
Yeah, you said to the guru guys, you said I actually like pre-Islamophobia Dawkins. You said, and I
yeah. I
appreciated
mean, I
that
like
way of saying.
his actual scientific work, and then he became a public figure who spent a lot of time showering. I thought, kind of disrespect on religion broadly and Islam specifically, which I didn't like.
Yeah,
Uh,
and Islam is arguably one of the most. I don't know, but yeah, Islam is a beautiful religion, in my opinion.
yeah,
So here's an introduction he wrote to the third edition. He said, "This brings me to the first point I want to make about what this book is not. I am not advocating a morality based on evolution. I'm saying how things have evolved. I am not saying how we humans uh, morally ought to behave. I stress this because I know I am in danger of being misunderstood by those people all too numerous who cannot distinguish a statement of belief in what is the case from an advocacy of what ought to be the case, the old Humean thing. My own feeling is that a human society based simply on the genes law of universal ruthless selfishness would be a very nasty society in which to live. But unfortunately, however much we may deplore something, it does not stop it being true. This book is mainly intended to be interesting, but if you would extract a moral from it, read it as a warning. Be warned that if you wish, as I do, to build a society in which individuals cooperate generously and unselfishly toward a common good, you can expect little help from biological nature. Let us try to teach generosity and altruism because we are born selfish. Let us understand what our own selfish genes are up to, because we may then at least have the chance to upset their designs, something that no other species has ever aspired to.
Yeah, there's part of that I think is a little misleading, but which I can get to. But I think, broadly, first of all, I agree with him. I encourage people to not think that when you're describing the way nature is, you're describing the way things ought to be. And if you say certain human behaviors or tendencies are natural, that doesn't mean that they're good. It also doesn't mean that they can't be changed. I think, it's your best bet if you're trying to improve the world is understand what the source of the things you don't like is, and in some cases that is human nature. But I would say, when he says you just have to accept the fact that we are selfish, or whatever, however he put it, and then refers to selfish genes. I mean, he above all should be careful about conflating those two, because one point of the selfish gene is that sometimes the selfishness of the gene, so-called selfish of the gene. In other words, the fact that natural selection selects genes that are good at replicating them, sometimes that translates into true altruism at the level of the organism. So sacrificing yourself to help close kin, for example, is the classic example. True altruism. You're not doing it because there may be reciprocation. You're doing it, as a technical matter, because there's a high chance that they possess the genes that are inclining you to do the altruism. But the point is, it is still, if you rush into a burning building to save a sibling and you die, that's true pure altruism. That wasn't selfish in any sense at the level of the organism, even if it was at the level of the gene. Now, other kinds of altruism, like reciprocal altruism, the story's a little different. They also, the kind of altruism we exhibit toward, say, friends, where we help them out. On the other hand, we kind of expect them to help us out. And if they quit helping us out and never do it again, we'll probably cease to be friends, right? That's a more conditional kind of altruism. And it's true that in a sense, is ultimately selfish at the level of the organism, or at least self-serving at the level of the organism. Fine, but I wouldn't have put it exactly the way he did. And more broadly, I would say, the good news is natural selection, although in many ways we are selfish, even ruthless, and self-centered, it did equip us with a lot of capacities and tendencies and feelings and so on that can be kind of redirected or harnessed or whatever, consciously, in ways that will lead life to be better than it might otherwise. So we do have altruistic impulses. We are all capable of love and compassion and so on. That's natural. It's built into us. Now, do we sometimes need to try to deploy those things in a less ultimately selfish way? Yes, but they're there to work with. And again, I think the more we understand about why they evolved and how they work, the better. But I certainly agree with him that what's natural needn't be with us forever, and it's not necessarily good, and we're better off understanding where it came from.
Do you think you could have written The Evolution of God before Nonzero?
Wouldn't have been a very natural order of things, because the evolution of God kind of took the thesis of Nonzero and applied it to the development of religions and religious ideas.
Yeah, that's what I thought. Yeah.
Yeah. I should have probably said, I should have stated that explicitly in the text, which I didn't. But it very much built on the book Nonzero.
Okay, so let's walk back a little bit. So it very much built on the idea of non-zero. It's not necessarily a teleological argument, but you are perceptive of developments in consciousness among sentient beings that seem to draw us ever further toward more and more reciprocity and complexity with respect to our cognition, something like that.
Well, the thesis of Nonzero is that if you ask, why have we gotten from a bunch of fairly isolated hunter-gatherer villages 12,000 years ago to a globally interconnected world and pretty interdependent, although maybe less so in 5 years than now, given the way things are going, but still something like a global social organization. The answer is that new technologies have come along that either facilitated or otherwise encourage the playing of non-zero sum games involving more and more people at greater and greater distance. So, the modern economy has all these little non-zero sum games we don't think about. Like when I buy a computer, I'm helping to pay the wages of people in God knows how many countries, and they're building me a computer. I never meet them, but it's an elaborate, collaborative exercise where we each do something that the other wants. They want wages, I want a computer. And it's a non-zero sum game in a technical sense. Even if you believe that some of these workers deserve more money or whatever, that may well be true. Playing non-zero sum games to win-win outcomes don't ensure that justice will always prevail or equity will always prevail or anything like that. But still, technically, it's a non-zero sum game.
It's not a rosy feel-good thing.
Well, it is win-win. It's good when people are not in poverty. And global trade has pulled tons of Asians out of poverty over the last 30, 40 years. So I think that in itself is a good thing. But anyway, the larger argument, and then there's and there's a related fact about human psychology, which is that I argue, and I argue this especially in The Evolution of God, when you see yourself as playing a non-zero sum game with someone such that you can both benefit from collaboration, you're more likely to take a tolerant attitude toward them.
So what do you think it is about why we do that? Like,
I think it's built into us by natural selection that when we perceive.
That's what I want to understand, because you're so much smarter than I am about biology, and I want to know, why do you think that's so functional? Because I'm a poetry guy. I'm all like words and etymologies, but you seem like you're really convinced about processes.
Well, let me ask you this: if you're on a plane and you strike up a conversation with a person next to you, and it turns out you just have something in common, like you're both passionately into poetry and the same kind of poetry, or it turns out you're both in the same line of work, and you figure out a way that maybe you could collaborate in a way that would benefit you both. Don't you just kind of like feel a little more warmly toward them?
100, yeah, absolutely.
And if they then tell you what religion they are, don't you think you're probably going to feel like you want to feel good about? You're not going to like go, oh, what a shitty religion. You're just in the mood to like them, right? You're just in the mood to be tolerant.
Now, why does that not play out in the whole military industrial capitalist context? Why is that subverted by the forces at large?
Well, what example do you have in mind?
Whatever. I guess the foremost would be Blinken and Ukraine and Russia.
Well, that's a very
like, why can't you say, like, oh yeah, you guys, you want borders, and I get it, like, it's something like that, but like, that's not what we do. We say we need to arm your resistance.
It's related to cognitive empathy, which is, I think, perceiving yourself to be in a non-zero sum situation. There are things that I think cues that you are in a non-zero sum situation can help bring the cognitive empathy into play. There are cues that have the opposite effect, and so it, and the point, and often the fact that we are in a non-zero sum situation doesn't really kind of get driven into our brains. We pick up on cues of zero sumness or whatever, and so the non-zero sum thing doesn't click into gear. But it's an incredibly complicated story. For example, if you go back and ask, why did we expand NATO, the thing that ultimately Putin found so threatening, even though in the 90s, most, kind of the, wise men, as they would have called them back then, who knew a lot about the Soviet Union, were saying, don't do this. Why did we do it? Well, one reason was the arms industry, which was lobbying for it because they knew they'd be able to sell a lot of arms to Europe. another reason was Clinton wanted to get a lot of votes from people of Eastern European ancestry in the 1996 election. And they wanted it because, being Eastern European in ancestry, they saw themselves as being in an inimical relationship with the Soviet Union. And so thought, the more you're protected militarily, the better we want, and so on. So ultimately, you had on the one hand the arms industry, which could benefit from the creation of tension and the perception of tension. And then you had voters who perceived a kind of tension, a kind of zero-sum game with the Soviet Union by virtue of identifying with their homelands. And the rest is history. So the cues are complicated. And then you had Clinton wanting to win the election, and look, you had Russia. Putin is not like he can be an antagonistic person, and he did his share to spoil relations, and probably often he saw it as being to his political advantage. But a lot of it is that we're just in an environment very different from the one we evolved to live in. We didn't evolve to orchestrate relations with people half a world away, or take into account the fact that a given fight could lead to the annihilation of the planet, or any of that. So it's a very complicated story. But to get back to your question, because I'm going to have to go in a couple of minutes, about the evolution of God, I do think that on balance, the accurate perception of non-zero sum relations can make you more favorably disposed toward a person, more tolerant of them, more tolerant of their religion. And that's why I think, and I traced that theme through the history of religion, tried to show that the more belligerent scriptures had been generated in a time when there was antagonism between the groups, when there was there was not a perception of win-win possibility between the
Would you be willing to equate that with the concept?
Well, yeah, I think wisdom includes the ability to see non-zero-sum possibilities that may not be naturally or intuitively obvious and work toward them. And the hope is that since the world is more and more non-zero-sum, I mean, climate change is we're pretty much all in the same boat. We work to solve the problem, and that on balance helps humanity, or we don't, and that on balance hurts humanity. Same with nuclear war, win-win or lose-lose. There's, same with economic things often, that our fortunes are going to be correlated with the fortunes of people halfway around the world. To the extent that we perceive that we're in the same boat, and are in a non-zero-sum game, you would hope that the appropriate, psychological reaction ensues. And I'm saying it's a natural reaction. I mean, that's the good news is when we perceive non-zero sum dynamics, it does bring out the more tolerant and cooperative in us, but we were designed by natural selection to see them in a particular context and to see non-zero sum dynamics of a particular kind that may not be what we're experiencing today. But anyway, so the evolution of God argued that religions had the capacity to respond to the perception of non-zero sum dynamics by evincing tolerance. So there's hope that as non-zero sum dynamics continue to be pretty pervasive, and I would think on balance more and more pervasive, although there is ebb and flow, that people will respond to that wisely, as you put it. Yeah, that's a perfect word to use. Yeah, it's wisdom.
I know that you're working toward doing a book on cognitive. Would you ever consider the potentiality of in 5 or 10 forward writing another book about these ideas, about the evolution of ideas? Maybe something like why Buddhism is one thing, maybe like why the human consciousness about divinity extends Vedic Indian literature, something like that. Would you ever consider drawing that further?
It's not on my list now. I mean, I'm in an age where conventionally people retire, and I'm working on a book on cognitive empathy. So I don't know. I don't consider kind of audacious to think about what I'll be doing in 10 years. But I never know with any confidence what book comes after the book I'm working on. I've never known that. So I don't know.
I only ask because you are so aware of traditions, and also you're so committed to sharp perception of reality. Like you, and it's very difficult to find a thinker like you that carries those two traits.
Wait, what was the first one?
You
Well, one was
you're at ease with tradition, and you
oh.
feel like you're informed by tradition, but you're also acutely aware of all of the troubling aspects.
Oh, I see. Well, I certainly am more tolerant of traditional religion than some people, which partly has to do with the way the way I see the mind working. I don't think when religions fight, I don't think the problem is the religious belief per se. The problem is that the groups see themselves as having, a zero-sum relationship and not the potential of kind of mutual gain. But
Sam Harris still doesn't hear that.
no, I
Sorry,
don't think so.
digression.
He didn't last time I checked. But I don't I don't know. I wouldn't rule anything out as a next book. But right now, I'm writing a book on cognitive empathy and got my hands full. And by the way, I have to go now. But I wanted to thank you because in the I think it was in the comment section in the Nonzero Newsletter, you steered me toward these things called empathy circles or something. I think it was a conversation with John Vervaeke
Yeah.
and somebody else. So, people had been saying, why don't you have a conversation with John Vervaeke? He wasn't the cognitive empathy. He wasn't the empathy circle guy. He was having a conversation with the empathy circle guy. But anyway, after checking that out, I did arrange a conversation with John Vervaeke, and I just posted it tonight.
Oh, hello! Really?
You could, when we sign off, you can go watch it. It was posted a couple of hours ago.
Oh,
so
God bless you.
you
God
deserve
bless
credit
you,
for
Bob
that.
Wright. Thank you.
Well, thank you.
That brings joy to my life. And I thank you for all of the time that you've invested in being a steward of your own newsletter, and you've always been kind to me, and thank you much.
Well, thank you for reading it, and keep up the good work.
I'll blast it out. Take care.
Okay, bye-bye.
Ciao.
Thank you, Eric.